Everyone, we're back for another Hot Rod Barbecue. Now, I will say, at some point in the future, it would be great if we could actually make this a real barbecue. You guys come over, we come over to your place, we set up the grill, we do a little cooking, have a couple beers, shoot the you know what. In the meantime, we've got some pretty great guests that we bring onto this thing. And this one and this week is no exception at all. This week, we've got one of my dear friends. His name's Bobby Green of the Old Crow Speed Shop. Now, Bobby is a hot rodder. He's a man about town. He's a bon vivant. He's a restaurateur. He's a bar owner. He's an historian. There's a lot of things that Bobby does, but it's all centered around car culture and Americana, as you will hear. And one of his passions is vintage racing. And when I say vintage racing, I mean vintage auto racing, especially from the pre-war era. And as I've been thinking about Bobby and thinking about what we're going to talk about, I was kind of jamming around Hemmings.com, looking for different cars that might represent something Bobby would be interested in and he might even buy. And I stumbled across this. It's a 2016 recreation of an early Harry Miller race car. So you'll see this thing when it pops up on screen if you're watching our YouTube version of this podcast. And it's a bright yellow recreation of a car called the Craftsman, which Harry Miller built along with his old buddy Offenhauser. And there's a great story along with the listing of this car. But if you take a look at this thing and see what kind of neat, craftsmanship and attention to detail went into the car, I thought it was a good representation of what Bobby does. So without further ado, hold on tight and enjoy the next hour or so with Bobby Green. We're back once again with the Hemmings Hot Rod Barbecue. Now, I've said this before, but I really mean it this time with our next guest, Bobby Green from the Old Crow Speed Shop. Now, when I say hot rod barbecue, we designed this pot. Oh my God, look at that. He's reading an issue of Garage Magazine.
What is this?
Issue 1.
What is this thing I'm reading?
What do you have there? What is that? How did you find? Does that have water stains on it? What is that?
Yeah. What year is this?
That's 2001 or 2002.
Yeah.
And folks at home, what Bobby's looking at right here is a copy of the very first issue of my first magazine. It's called Garage, that we produced back in 0102. And he and I were just talking about this. Look, if this is nothing else, this is true testament that Bobby is probably one of the premier collectors, if not, I will call him, aficionados and cultural anthropologists of hot rodding in this country and probably countries beyond. Is that fair to say, Bobby?
Pretty cool moniker. I like
what
that.
What do you think of that? You like that little tee up right there? All right.
Yeah. I saved this.
I can't believe you saved that.
So you had given me a stack of maybe 20 of them back probably 01.
Yeah.
And you said, hey, pass these out to people in LA. And so I think I saved about 5 of them for myself. And they were in my garage as I'm building the Old Crow belly tank and some other cars, and it got wet, so they're a little warped.
But you still have them, dude. That's the important thing.
It's warped in more ways than one. You know what I
mean? Well said. And that's 5 more copies than I have because I kept giving them away, and then my wife just stopped me from doing that, and she kept them. And she's like, I'm not telling you where I'm keeping these anymore because you'll give those away too, which I probably would.
Totally. But it's nice. It's kind of a walk back in time. I mean, like my old friend.
That's right. Otto von Stroheim and his
wife. We were part of that early tiki thing back in the 90s.
Well, this is what, and that is a perfect segue into why I want to introduce Bobby Green to the rest of you folks at home, because Bobby is one of the few people I know who not only have gone deep into about every corner of traditional hot rodding and car culture and Americana from pre-war on up, right? I mean, in general, right? But there's so many, we're going to need like 7 hours for this podcast. So we're not going to do that. I'm going to skim over most of the things, but The collecting alone,
we'll make it a series.
We'll make it a series. That's right. I think that's a good idea. And for people who are listening to this podcast, you know, on your favorite podcast platform, do yourself a favor and make sure you check out the YouTube version of this so you can see what Bobby's sitting amongst and in right now. This is Old Crow Speed Shop, the version 2.0, maybe, or is this right?
Well, we were in Burbank, you know, for 15, 16 years.
Yeah.
And we were on borrowed time the whole time. I mean, from day one, they're like, well, we're going to tear the building down.
Ooh.
Probably in a few years, but if you want to rent it for really cheap, you can just rent it month to month. And I said, okay, sure. And I was hoping to get 2-3 years out of it. Ended up being 16 years, thanks to the great crash of 07.
Yeah, right.
Which stopped all construction, you know, in LA. And so, yeah, we got it for 15, 16 years. And
where's your shop now?
It's in Pasadena. It's in
Pasadena. Okay.
Old town Pasadena. It's an old church.
Is it? Oh, that I have to come down and see that. Yeah, we'll have to come down and see that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Bobby, set the stage. We're going to get into everything that at least breeze over most things that you've accomplished and done. But bring me up to speed and kind of like give us a background on how you came to Los Angeles. I want to dig into like your background and what you do for a living, because I think that is amazing. I want to ask you specific questions about that. But how did you come to LA and how did you get into cars and Americana as sort of a collection and a movement and a personal vendetta? Bring us up to speed. How did you get to where you're sitting right now?
Well, it started, I was born in Oklahoma. So the first like 9 years of my life, I had this kind of like middle America farm life. My grandparents farmed wheat. My dad was an artist. So I kind of grew up in Americana, but not flashy Americana, very roots, you know, to the bone kind of Americana. Mm-hmm. And then, so my mom kept bringing me and my sister out to LA starting when I was about 9 years old. So this is in the very late 70s, early 80s. And it's for a kid from Oklahoma to come to LA at that time, it'd be like a trip to Disneyland.
It's a mind blower, right?
Totally mind blowing. I mean, just a palm tree was exotic.
A big deal, right? A seagull.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. The beach, the girls, the cars, the architecture, you know, all that just completely blew me away as a kid. And so then we just moved here when I was about 10. And so it was like this explosion of pink Cadillacs and turquoise Chevys. And there was still a ton of like 50s cars still on the road. They're only 30 years old, you know, or 25 years old. So
they're used cars, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So there's just awesome cars everywhere. And then the whole crazy new wave 80s deal with Ventura Boulevard and, you know, and cruising Hollywood Boulevard. So it was just complete fascination from the moment I landed here.
Wow. So you got to be a teenager in LA. Is that what just basically, your formative
junior high. Yeah. Junior high, high school, the whole thing. Yeah.
Wow.
So that really just blew me away. And I had this great appreciation for it because coming from somewhere else, the juxtaposition was so like incredible.
Right.
And I couldn't get enough of it. You know, I got an old car. I got a 57 Chevy when I was 16.
A 57 Chevy when you were 16?
Yeah.
That is so LA. That's amazing.
You know, it's funny too, because you know, my family wasn't into old cars. They had like Novas but they were more like utilitarian. It was like your transportation,
right? And
you'd work on the engine to keep it running, but it wasn't like to go to the cruise night or anything.
It wasn't fashionable. Yeah.
No. And so at 16, I knew I wanted an old car. And I told my family I wanted an old car. And my aunt sent me, this is back when the penny saver was out.
Yeah, sure.
She sends me this tiny little cutout, black and white cutout of an ad from the penny saver. And it was a 57 Chevy. And it had all this weird information. I didn't know what the hell it was talking about, but it was like $3,000, right? So that was pretty good. That's all I could afford at the time. And so I called the guy and I'm like, hey, I'm interested in your Chevy. And he's like, oh, let me tell you about it. It's primered and it's slammed and it's got flipper caps and it's got Nomad trim and it's got a Corvette engine and it's got a Hurst shifter on the floor. He's just rambling all this stuff. I'm like, does it run?
You're like, no idea, right?
And it came from the
keys
Bay
for
Area.
it, yeah.
Yeah,
Did it really?
It came from San Francisco. And the guy's like, I said, well, could you drive it down to LA? And he's like, sure, I'll drive it down. So the guy drives it down and his buddy follows him in a 59 Chevy custom. So these are both customs, right? This 57 Chevy was a full custom, shaved, had a Buick grill, had a Corvette motor, slammed, poppers for the doors, the whole bit.
The whole deal.
And then his buddy follows him in a 59 with flipper caps, the whole thing. And it's funny because they weren't lowriders.
There was customs.
They were 60s customs. Yeah. Nowadays, if you had a 59 Chevy or a 57 Chevy, it's probably either going to be bone stock or a gasser,
right?
Or a lowrider.
Yeah, lay-in frame, right?
Yeah, but this was that weird kind of pre-early custom deal. So that kind of inadvertently launched me into the alternative scene. Well, I mean, alternative meaning not stock car scene.
Right.
So I would drive it to Bob's Big Boy and meet custom people. And of course, the Chevy Club people would just laugh at it.
Yeah, because it's the 80s, right? And they didn't understand that the custom scene at this point was 25 years old or whatever, and they were way past that in their minds, right?
Yeah, exactly. It either should be at that time, it should have been totally painted bone stock, or pink with a heartbeat on the side, and the bumpers were pink too. That was kind of like the two sides of the coin. So I just met hot rodders and custom guys, and that was it. Yeah.
And so through that car, did you tap into that? Because I know at that time in the 80s, especially, even in the late 80s, that return, or that hot rod revival, that scene was really starting to gain a head of steam, right? I mean, was that what you were tapping into with that car?
Yeah, and I didn't even know anybody my age at that time in that scene, because I'm like 17 years old. This is like 1986, 87, and so I was just meeting older people mostly. I remember one of the first guys I met at the Bob's Big Boy Cruise-In was, that Model A tub, the Phaeton tub, and the guy had covered it with like Hot Rod magazine.
Yes,
like decoupage the whole thing.
Yep.
I remember meeting him. I remember like looking at his car, like, this is the craziest thing ever.
No
and
kidding.
So I met guys like that.
Pete Eastwood.
Pete Eastwood. And it wasn't until the 90s when I started meeting people my age that also had primered, lowered, cars.
Okay. So by that time, then this I always sort of hate calling it traditional hot rodding, because it was more of a revival back to a lot of different versions, styles that were happening in the 50s and 60s and in the 40s post-war, right? But and you especially, so you were born in roughly the same time I was, like early 70s, 1970s. So like you were actually right in the midst of, you were the perfect age for like not only that scene, but also the lounge, the ultra lounge scene, right? Like Swingers movie.
Exactly.
That kind of stuff, right?
I was in the thick of it. We would go to the Derby dancing. We would go to Linda's Doll Hut. We would go to anywhere that there was a Western swing show or a rockabilly show. A lot of places in Hollywood. So yeah, that was my scene. And that's what also got me into the bar business.
Okay. So that's a great segue. So you're doing this stuff, you're basically living the dream. And I think you were part of that hot rod underground that really hadn't hit the mainstream yet, because obviously this is pre-social media and pre-internet. But you had, and if you were going to find out about this stuff, it was either through magazines like Gearhead and some of those things, or maybe like, I remember when that Ultra Lounge CD set came out and our minds were all blown, like, what is this? And there were a couple of those. I think there was a Tiki magazine that Otto von Stroheim was doing at the time, right?
He launched that at my coffee house.
Did he really?
Yeah. So I wasn't living the dream. Because I was poor as dirt, but I was learning how to work on my car, learning how to fix it, and, teaching myself mechanics. Okay. And then I was working in coffee houses because it was like the most social kind of cool thing. This is pre-Starbucks days. That was
your network, right? Yeah.
Yeah. That's when you meet artists and musicians, and people would hang out all night, play chess, that kind of bohemian coffee house type of deal. And so I was but I was also an artist and a designer. So I was going to go to Art Center for product design or environmental design, something like that. And I ended up getting a call from actually a guy that fired me from a coffee house.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I got fired. I was fired from every job I ever had.
It's a great resume.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is basically why I had to work for myself. But
Makes
he called
sense.
me. I get a call from him, and he says, "Hey, you and your buddies were always talking about how you could do this coffee house thing better than me. So why don't you guys buy me out?" And I'm like, "Oh, well, hold on. Let me make a couple phone calls and I'll get back to you." And I called a couple of friends, and again, cars, right? So I had the 57 Chevy, and then I ended up finding this Nash Metropolitan that had no transmission, right?
Wow.
And I bought it for, I don't know, $600.
Yeah, $10. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And then I meet a guy at Bob's Big Boy who they call Metropolitan Bob, right?
Of course, right?
I go meet Metropolitan Bob, and I'm like, "Hey, I need a transmission." He's like, "Oh yeah, I got one on the side of my house in Northridge. Why don't you just come by? I'll give it to you for $20." So I get a buddy to help me, and we put the trans in, and the thing runs and drives fine. It's like bone stock.
Of course, because it's a Metropolitan. That's what they're made to do. It's basically like a little Lego kit. Yeah.
Useless but fun.
Right.
So I sold it to come up with my share to buy this coffee house. Wow. I sold it for like $3,000 or something.
Of course.
But so that's what launched me into entrepreneurship and hospitality business, was running my own coffee house.
Amazing. And so before we go any further, does that coffee house still exist?
Yeah, it does. It was called Cacao. They changed the name of it recently, but it's still there. It's in West LA.
Wow.
And so me and my buddies, we just liked funky themed stuff. So we decided to turn the coffee house into a tiki sci-fi themed coffee house. Wow. And this is about 1993.
Boy, that's pretty forward thinking for you guys. I mean, because you were ahead of that game, because that really hit, like, that scene sort of hit like late 90s, like 10 years later almost.
Yeah, we were just doing what we thought was cool and fun. Like, there was no game plan, there was no guidebook for it. It was just, there was a couple things out, like CAD magazine. There's a book called CAD, and Coop had done a lot of illustrations. There were a few, like, you go to Wacko in Hollywood.
Yep.
And they sold all the weird. They sold stuff like satanic stuff to Santeria, to like weird counterculture stuff, right? But it didn't really have a defined scene at the time. It was just kind of there. And but tiki and sci-fi, that's pretty darn cool. We loved vintage, so
it's a great mashup. Yeah.
So we did that. That's how I met Otto. And Otto lived down the street, and he's decided to start Tiki Magazine. He was throwing tiki parties in his backyard.
Wow.
He had a tiki bar that Coop had made. The artist Coop had made it. And then I ended up
Right.
buying it from him when Otto moved to San Francisco.
Okay. And what a great little scene, because we all knew each other, you know, everyone, if you were doing this stuff in any sort of way, even though that network, looking back now, was a lot more difficult to kind of dig into, boy, once you were tapped into it, it was sort of like this river of sort of like subcultures that was just under the surface of everything else, right?
Yeah, for sure. And it was all 20 of us. I mean, there weren't that many people.
Yeah, you could
but
fit
it
them
was
on your
super,
house.
It was super fun. We were just kind of making it up as we went along,
God.
which was kind of the creative fun part of it.
Yeah. So as you started building that business, now is that how the 1933 group started? Is that how your business started into what it is right now?
Yeah. So
okay,
I had the coffee house, and it was so much. It was super fun, but made no money. I mean, I was living off of like $1,000 a month.
Wow.
And luckily, I had a rent control apartment in Santa Monica with Piero DeLuca.
Yes, I know Piero. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
He was my roommate, and we had some funny times. But I loved doing what I was doing. I loved meeting the people. I was like so super social. I got to meet all kinds of amazing artists and people. But I had to figure out a way to do it and make money. So,
there's always that, right? That pesky little.
yeah. It really gets in the way of things. But but that's also when I was hanging out in Hollywood, going to rockabilly shows, hanging out at the Burgundy Room and the Derby and stuff. So it was like, this is the same thing I'm doing, but just selling booze instead of coffee. And there's a better profit margin there. I was
going to say the profit margin alone. Yeah.
So the coffee house was my 6 years of college. That was my business college, teaching myself how to run a business. And so then I spent 3 years trying to find investor partners to open the Bigfoot Lodge.
Yes.
Which we opened, that opened in 99.
Wow.
99.
One of my favorites. Was the Bigfoot Lodge was this amazing space that it looked like a log cabin lodge, building, or like a log cabin, but it was it still is one of the coolest bars, because it had a Bigfoot in it, right? Like a hand carved Bigfoot behind the wall or whatever. Amazing place.
Thanks. Well, it was back when, just during those creative days, we had done the coffee house, right? We had created this thematic space that you could come into and enjoy. So we thought up a million different themes. Me and friends would sit around thinking of themes for bars. Oh, you could do a mermaid bar. You could do this. You could do that. The whole point was kind of like an adult Disneyland, in a sense, where you take somebody straight from work, their daily grind, traffic on the freeway all day long, and throw them into an environment that's completely opposite of where they just came from. Right. That's relaxing. And so we just kept thinking, and at the time I was into Twin Peaks. We were all watching Twin Peaks.
Sure.
And I used to go skiing as a kid in Colorado and New Mexico. So it was like, well, what can we do that doesn't exist in LA that would just completely take people to another world? And the log cabin seemed perfect.
God, what a great, and I can see now that you've explained that, and I've been to several of your places, your bars and things, I can see that theme kind of running throughout. Like, this is an escape. You show up here for the time you're here, and you're going to enjoy yourself, and it's an escape from what you just went through to get here. And that's sort of uniquely LA, right? Because it takes so long to get from point A to point B. It's a commitment.
Exactly.
Right.
It is. And LA has a look. It's got its own look, but it's not the mountains, and it's not Hawaii. So it's the same as you would throw a themed, tiki party at home, where everyone dresses up and you play hula music and drink Mai Tais. It's the same thing. It's like, let's just pretend we're somewhere else. Let's have a fantasy night and not think about our daily troubles. And that's what the Bigfoot Lodge was supposed to be. And that's what it became.
Now I'm going to skip ahead because there's a lot of other things that you were doing between the Bigfoot Lodge and what I'm going to get into now. But tell me about programmatic architecture and how you got into that. Tell me what that is, because I think especially for the people listening to this thing, that idea of a roadside attraction, which really had a lot to do with commerce and how people, spent their leisure time and stuff. Tell me about programmatic and how you got into that and what that turned into for you.
Yeah. Well, again, the weird thread of my life always comes back to the automobile. Programmatic architecture was started because of the automobile. So think back 1910, 1912, right? If you're going to go somewhere, you're going to go to a store, you're probably on your horse, or you're walking downtown and you're going 5 miles an hour. So the guy that owns a hardware store or a restaurant or whatever, all he has to do is hang a little sign in the window, Joe's Restaurant, and everybody sees it. Okay.
Because you're walking by, right?
You're walking by, or you're just riding your horse and cart. Well, enter the Model T, right? So now suddenly everyone can afford a car, and they're going 25 miles an hour past your business. They don't really see your little sign anymore. And
streaking by at 25 miles an hour, they're not going to see the little Joe's. Yeah, they're not going to see Joe's Restaurant. Right.
Exactly.
Right.
So Joe and a million other people across the country decided, wait, we need to do something so that these people in cars will see us from blocks away, and they'll know what to expect. So the word programmatic architecture, I don't think was coined until maybe the 80s by a writer who coined it that. But basically it was a building that looked like something other than a building that usually represented what was inside. So a giant shoe would be a shoe store. The Derby, obviously a giant hat, which is a restaurant. That's a bit of an anomaly, but it's all programmatic architecture. It's a giant, the bulldog, a giant bulldog, the Idle Hour, which was my first restoration of a real historical place, is a giant whiskey barrel, 2-story tall whiskey barrel.
So cool.
Yeah. So you would know 2 blocks away, hey, let's go get a whiskey or a cold beer at the giant keg.
Right. Yeah.
And
you're not going to mistake that for the shoe house that was completely different. Right. Okay. Got it.
Exactly.
It makes sense.
But it was fantasy. It was fun. It was automotive related. It's the same thing that I do with, what I do with my businesses. And it was very Los Angeles.
Wow.
Because Los Angeles at the time, you look at the 20s and 30s Los Angeles, it was a giant farm. I mean, there was orange groves, pasture. There was nothing here. Every other city in America was already built. Chicago, New York, Oklahoma City, they were all built up.
Right.
LA was this blank canvas that all these creative people who wanted to make movies and do anything, have ostrich farms and build a tram that goes to the top of a mountain, they all moved here because it was the great Wild West, that you could be anything you want, do anything you want. And so that's why programmatic architecture boomed so greatly. Wow. And you had the trades, you had the film industry. So you had all these guys making the pyramids of
set
Egypt.
Builders, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So why not just have these guys build you a giant hot dog and sell hot dogs?
It totally makes sense. Now you say it that way, it just totally makes sense.
It really does, actually. And in 1980, coming to LA as a kid, there were still a bunch of these around.
Man, now digging into the Idle Hour in particular, and that was your first one like that. It was some sort of was it like a Spanish restaurant or some sort of like a Mexican restaurant or something like that?
It's a neat story. So this woman, Dolores Fernandez, bought it from the family in the 1972, and she was a flamenco dancer. So it was originally built in 1941, called the Idle Hour. It was just a wooden barrel. She buys it in 72. She wants to have a dinner show where she can dance every night and do her flamenco dancing. And in the 70s, these kind of buildings were getting really passe. It's like, that old weird architecture, you know?
Yeah.
They were getting torn down left and right, all over the place. But she decided to like paint the building white, name it Lacana, put an awning so it didn't quite look like a barrel anymore, and then turned it into a flamenco dinner show, which she did. She did until about 1985, 86, and she was hit by a car walking across the street and broke her hip.
No more flamenco.
She couldn't dance anymore. So she decided, I'm just going to close the restaurant and live in it. So she was the crazy old lady that lived in a barrel.
Man.
And she lived there until 2010, when she passed away. So had she not lived there, the building would have been torn down ages ago. It would have been a stucco box, and it would have been a video store, you know. But she, in a weird way, by squatting in her own building and not paying property tax, she saved the building.
Wow.
And because she had no family and she owed 30 years of property tax, she died, and the city of the state seized the property. And a very active friend of mine named Chris Nichols in the preservation movement here in Los Angeles, before she died, he worked on getting the building landmarked as one of the last surviving programmatic architecture buildings left. So he saved it. So she passes away, and then he calls me. And at that time, I was known, I guess, amongst the vintage world and the people in preservation as creating vintage themed places. Like they knew I loved vintage themed places. So he thought I'd be the perfect person to save this place. We did a huge deep dive into that one. I mean, it was a 2-year restoration. It cost a fortune.
Oh, the work you did. You even reproduced the clock that was above the front door. I mean, it was amazing what you've done with that place. We've been to that.
There was a blurry picture of the clock, and I took it to a friend of mine named Curtis Clock, and that's all he does is vintage clocks. And I said, "Can you tell what this is from this photograph?" And he knew exactly what model it was, and he restored one for me, and we put it up there. But it's the details. We go to every little detail. It's the same as a perfectly restored, circa 1945 hot rod. You have to know what to not put on it, and you have to know what to put on it. And it's the same with restoring a business or a building or anything.
Now you've also got, I think, and I've seen pictures of that you've posted on social, so I don't think I'm giving anything away. You've also got Tail O The Pup and the Formosa.
The Formosa, we restored the Formosa.
Famous LA eateries and establishments, right?
Yeah, the Formosa was huge, especially for me, because the Idle Hour, I never got to go there. I could drive by it when I was in junior high school, but it was closed. It was closed from 85 till 2010. So, but
because a little lady was living in it, right?
She was living, it was her house. But Formosa, I was hanging out there all the time in the 90s. That was a hot hangout. And it was full of celebrities, full of, Guns N' Roses was there all the time. Keanu Reeves and all the young, hot people, Drew Barrymore.
Right.
It was really hot. And so to come back years later and get to restore that place is a dream, a second dream come true.
Now the Formosa, what needed to be restored? Like, what had it fallen on hard times, or did it just it been remodeled and remodeled and remodeled?
It had kind of just been let go for so long. It was really falling apart. And then in around 2009, it had been added onto, but not in a cohesive way at all. It had been kind of built onto with this kind of weird modern deck and a weird smoking patio, and none of it made any sense, So I wanted to restore it all. And the cool thing about Formosa, it has a train car attached to it. And that train car was put there in 1940. Okay, so we knew it was an old red car train. And it wasn't until we started doing our research, which we do with every project, we research everything. We come to find out that that train car is the oldest surviving red car train in existence.
Wow.
It was from 1906. So by 1940, it was surplus. It was a junker, and you could buy it for cheap and add it to your restaurant. So we wanted to do a really proper restoration of the train car itself outside of the Formosa. Like, you know, it needed its own attention as to what did it look like in 1906 to 1930 when it was running around. And so that's kind of what it looks like now when you go into it.
Is the red car that trolley or that train that they showed in Who Framed Roger Rabbit? Is that the red car? Okay. You know, now I know the story.
Who Framed Roger Rabbit is the best historical depiction that we have.
Is it really?
Of what the LA red car line was like and why it got destroyed by the oil companies and the automotive industry. They bought it and they dismantled it because they wanted to build freeways and sell gasoline.
So what you're saying is actually what I've always believed for all these years. Who Framed Roger Rabbit is actually a true story. Is that what you're saying?
It's a true story. Minus the talking rabbit.
Oh, no, to ruin it for me. Okay. That's all.
But yeah, it's a true story. It's like Cars, you know, and how Cars depicts Route 66 and the glory days of travel through America. I guess we need cartoons to tell us our true history, right?
Dude, I think that's always been true. We just kind of grew up and got away from that truth. I think we just need to, through you, rediscover our truth. I think that's right. I think that's what I'm here for. What you're here for. And Tail O The Pup, I mean, that's another one of those, like, little, as small as it is, that's another little icon that if you're a car guy or a car gearhead or anything like that, and you come to LA, Tail O The Pup is something that you've probably heard of if you've not seen pictures of. There's that great photo of Sigourney Weaver eating a hot dog out in front of the place. I mean, what's the story with that thing now?
Tail O The Pup is really more famous than the Formosa because it was such a visual icon as you drive by it. It was designed 1938 by an architect, but it didn't get built until 46 because of the World War II. It got put on hold and they finished it after the war. But it's probably the most famous hot dog stand in the world because it's been in so many movies. Right. It's in LA Story, it's in Columbo, it's on TV shows, it's been in print ads. So, and it was something I remember from 1980 as a kid. You know, I remember our first trip to Los Angeles and driving around and going back to Oklahoma. And all I could remember was the Hollywood sign and the Tail O The Pup.
No kidding. Like, that's not Randy's Donuts. Randy's Donuts wasn't sticking with you, but no, the Tail O The Pup did.
It was in Hollywood. Randy's Donuts is over by the airport. You don't really see it if you're over on the west side, but Tail O The Pup is in the center of Hollywood. So it's like part of the whole fantasy world of Hollywood.
I think so.
So it's sadly the owners died. The kids didn't want to keep it going. So around 2005, they thought ahead and they put the building in storage. So they saved the building by putting it in storage. And so we were able to work a deal with them a couple years ago and get the building.
Now, when you say you put it in, the owners put it in storage, how big or small? I've never seen the thing in person. Like, how big or small is this thing?
I mean, it's like a big forklift can carry it around.
Okay.
So it's like 18 feet long, 9 feet wide, 6 feet deep. You can move it around. You know, it's mostly metal and stucco.
I was going to ask what it's made out of.
Yeah, like the flat parts are all metal, but the round ends are stucco. So, you know, you could lift it with the forklift and move it around. So that's why it was savable.
Wow. Like, is it like chicken wire underneath that stucco? Like, how do they actually? Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, it's actually wood framed and chicken wire.
Wow.
Yeah. Wow. 1946 construction.
And it's salvageable, obviously, right? I mean,
it's actually in pretty good shape. Yeah. It's in pretty good shape. We're doing.
What's your plan for it? Where are you going to put it?
It's going back in Hollywood, as close to the original location as possible. Oh, it's taken us 2 years to find the perfect location because I could not do it an injustice by putting it somewhere not quite what people remember. It had to be on a major street, preferably a corner, as close to the center of Hollywood as possible. So we finally found an amazing location. We're working on the lease right now.
Oh, good.
So
good.
Knock on wood, we'll hopefully, we're hoping to have it open by the end of the summer.
Oh, I can't wait to see that. That's going to be amazing.
Yeah,
get a hot dog. Okay, now here's this I think is a perfect setup for the next thing I want to ask you about. I think that here's my theory. I think that you, unlike a lot of other people in the world, I think you've spent your career, whether you realize it or not, or whether you just do it by just your natural instincts, you have been this connective tissue between the hot rodding scene and the car world and like popular culture, American popular culture. And the reason I say that is because not only through like the restaurants and the bars that you've developed and things like that, because I think obviously with the programmatic architecture that you're in the midst of restoring, that is car culture that's made for the masses, right? And I think a lot of people might not even realize what they're experiencing when they're there, which is fine too, you know. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that I've always been just blown away by is your relationship with fashion brands, you know, like the Tommy Hilfigers of the world or the Ralph Laurens. And one of the things that I just was blown away by 10, 15, I don't know how many years ago this was now, was that the Tommy Hilfiger campaign that used your belly tank. And all of a sudden I'm seeing like Bobby Green's hot rods in major magazines, you know, which our world had really not been seen at that level and across those platforms yet. Right. So could you tell us a little bit about how that happened?
Well, oddly, it really had nothing to do with my love of fashion. And as you know, fashion is very important to me.
Sure.
And it was important to me as a teenager. Like I was buying vintage clothing. And, back before I think there was a rule book of, what you do as a car guy, I was just figuring it out on my own. So to me, if I'm going to drive a 57 Chevy around Los Angeles, well, I want to listen to the music from that era. And I want to wear the clothes of that era. Like I want to do a complete time travel in my own mind and in my own city and just and be in that world, because everything I saw that was new was so mundane and boring. So I just wanted something to be a little different. And thank God I didn't have that rule book. Thank God I didn't go to a good guy show and realize oh, I gotta wear a T-shirt with my car airbrushed on it and shorts and a lawn chair. You know what I mean? Like, totally. Thank goodness that didn't happen.
Right.
And it always boggled my mind when I'd go to car shows and these cars would show up like period perfect. Guys would go to great lengths to get everything right. Kinmont brakes and the right tires and everything. And then they'd get out like wearing flip-flop shorts and the T-shirt, and it just seemed so odd to me, but it was completely normal to everybody else, but to me it was so weird. But so fashion wise, the Tommy Hilfiger thing actually came about because of the book, The Birth of Hot Rodding. Remember the book?
Beautiful love book. That book. Yes, that's in everybody's library. Yeah,
some of the only color photography of back in 1948. So someone in the Tommy Hilfiger camp in the design department got a hold of this book, saw the imagery, thought, wow, this is amazing. We should emulate this for our next season, right? So they send a guy, a scout, to Bonneville because they hear Bonneville this is where these cars were photographed on doing land speed racing, right? Yeah. So this scout shows up and he's there all weekend photographing cars. But what people don't realize is that the cars that are racing land speed now, they don't look like the cars that were racing in 1948.
No.
So this kid comes up to me and he's like, hey, I want to talk to you. I'm from Tommy Hilfiger and they're interested in using your car. And I'm like, oh, really? That's really cool. And they're like, yeah, yours is the only car they like.
Right? Wow. And tell us what that car was, because that was a big part of it, right?
It was that's the Old Crow, which is the belly tank
The belly
I
tank.
built, and it was built to replicate the cars that were running early post-war. And I wanted it to look exactly like the cars that were running early post-war. Same wheels, same tires, same tank. And I went to great lengths again to get all the safety equipment, the roll cage, fire suit, fire things, everything inside the body, so you don't see it.
Right.
So when you see the car, it looks like it could have rolled right out of 1948. But it's able to compete land speed racing today.
Modern safety specs, all that stuff, but hidden underneath. Right.
Exactly.
Okay.
Which is why it took 3 years to build, because it was just, the calculating it was so much.
Sure.
And so because this guy had this book and he's there looking for cars like that, mine was one of the only cars. It didn't look modern and have stickers all over it and sponsors and stuff. So they said, we'd like to use this car. And then they said, well, we need a couple more. Do you know any more? And I'm like, no,
Not
there aren't
really,
any.
huh? Yeah.
I'm like, we could throw some together for you, because I had a tank. I had a couple just tanks. I gave one tank to my friend Logan, and he just welded up a quick little frame and axle and wheels. And I had another tank that was just bare metal, and we pieced it together. And then 2 weeks later, we drive back to Bonneville with all 3 belly tanks.
All 3 tanks. Okay. One full race car and the other 2 mocked up for the shoot, essentially.
Yeah, the other 2 were just rollers.
Yeah.
And here's these like giraffe of supermodel people, coming out and hanging out with the belly tanks, and
these aliens coming down to the salt flats.
It was fun. It was fascinating to be a part of. And we were out there for a few days shooting. And that was really fun. But I didn't really have anything to do with the fashion. That was just by
That's
chance.
Tommy Hilfiger, right? Yeah, right.
Yeah, I ended up starting my own clothing line. I guess about 2014 in Japan. After I'd gone to Japan with the belly tank.
Oh, did you really? You took it there?
Yeah, Sige from Moon Eyes,
sure.
and Chico, they came up to me at El Mirage and they said, hey, we'd like to invite your car to Moon Eyes. And I'd heard about it. I'd heard about, because the Choppers went out there and a few other people I knew had gone.
It's an annual car show, right? It's a one-day annual car show in December in Japan.
In Yokohama. Yeah. And I had heard, hey, Moon Eyes, if they invite your car, they pay for everything. The car, the transportation, your hotel. And I thought, wow, what a dream trip that would be. Because, at that time, Japan was kind of expensive to go to. And so I was just so stoked.
That's amazing.
I was like, yes, that sounds great.
Let me check my schedule. Yeah, I'm free, right? Like that's how that worked. Yeah.
And speaking of social media, because we were talking about all these days of pre-social media, right?
Right.
But 2013, when I'm taking the belly tank to Japan, social media existed. So, and I was into fashion. I was finding Japanese people that were crazy into American fashion, vintage American fashion, and making some incredible reproductions of clothing that I only wish I could have found back when I was in my 20s.
Right.
I had to buy old vintage. They didn't have remakes of vintage. So I had already kind of become friends with a lot of these people in Japan through social media before I got there. And then when I got there, they were all at the show and we could all say hi to each other. And we were instant friends because we had been following each other for a couple of years prior to that.
Sure.
So, I've always been a huge fan of Instagram and finding people that are like-minded, like myself and probably like yourself.
Sure.
And so luckily I ended up meeting a couple of guys that I really admired their clothing and their quality of clothing. And after a year or so of friendship, they asked if I'd be interested in doing a collaboration. I said, yes, let's do that.
And that's like, is this like selvage denim and things like that and bomber ties, that kind of stuff? Okay.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. The first season. So I love it because I get to design everything, or I get to show them the inspiration for a season, and they make it, and they, you know, they're the ones who sell it and distribute it and all that kind of stuff. So I don't have to kind of do the non-design work. I just get to do the fun part. But the first season was interesting because they flew over here, and I basically just pulled out my wardrobe, like what I wear.
Here's Tuesday, right?
Yeah, including like my old jeans that I've repaired over the years. You know, they rip and they're worn, and they took everything back with them and made exact replicas. Like,
wow, they actually took your clothes back with them to Japan and replicated that stuff. Wow.
Yes. And so if you put my old pair of jeans with its rips and repairs and fading and everything next to a brand new Old Crow pair of jeans you could buy today, exactly the same.
So I could be this. I could be the 6'2" Bobby Green. Is that what you're saying? Like I could actually like just buy everything that you wear and just rule the world with it? I'm down with that. I'm down with that.
but now it changes every season. So we're on our 6th season now, and I'll usually pick a theme for the season. Like we did a nautical theme year. We did a dry lakes theme year. We've done aviation themed. It's a lot of fun. It's just a fun side extension of what I do anyway.
Amazing.
I get to wear it.
Do you feel like the Japanese, and as well with several other, you know, sort of like foreign lands that I can think of, but do you think the Japanese kind of just see something in what we do that we just don't see? Are we too busy living it to understand it, or what is that?
We're too busy living past it. The Japanese have always been fashion forward.
Right.
If you go to Japan, no one's walking around in shorts and t-shirts. Everybody looks like they either just came from the mall and got a brand new outfit, or a really nice suit, or they're dressed crazy. You know, they're dressed like strawberry shortcake, or a goth girl.
Yeah.
You know, but they have this like super appreciation for fashion, and regardless of era or style, but they're all stylish. And so a large subculture of them, probably starting back in the 70s and 80s, really started loving American fashion, workwear, from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s of America. And it was the same thing I was loving. You know, like I'd watch old movies and everyone just looked better. Everyone dressed better. Everyone had a collar on their shirt. Everyone had a cool jacket. Look at James Dean, Rebel Without a Cause, that red jacket, the blue jeans. Super iconic. The Wild Bunch. You know, and for somehow in America, we just got away from it. We just kind of moved past it. And then when we look back at it for some sad reason, it looks costumey or corny.
Yeah.
Rather than us like really embracing it and being like, this is the coolest thing. I mean, Americans don't realize that we created some of the most iconic pop culture things, whether it be from clothing to cars to music to buildings, in that 21st century. You know, the turn of this century, the 1900s up until through the 60s, we had created things that the rest of the world had never seen before.
That's so true.
And we kind of just, you know, shrug it off as like, well, whatever, let's do something else.
Next, right? Yeah.
And, you know, and maybe to our credit, because we have that attitude, we never would have created it in the first place. But at the same time, it's kind of sad that we don't stop and appreciate it more. And I think people are starting to, you know, I think a lot of the media now is helping to promote that, American Pickers and things like that. It's helping to promote, wait, look at this really cool stuff we did that we can never do again. We can never build this again. We don't even have the machines to do it anymore.
Right. That's well, and that goes back to like even like the denim you were talking about, right? Like the denim that we used to make, the Japanese have, as I've heard, even bought the machines that we used to use to make that great denim, and that stuff is over in Japan now. Is that true?
Yeah, it's true. The Europeans and the Japanese bought a lot of our salvage denim machines, and they make the best denim in the world now, and they love it. So we had this instant kinship, obviously, that subculture of Japan and me, we were cut from the same cloth, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so I had instant friends there, and fascinating.
They're still making that. So you still have lines coming out, but you can't buy that stuff here, right? I mean, it has to. That's a Japanese. Old Crow is a Japanese fashion brand now, right?
Well, but it's branching out now. Though there's a store in London.
Oh, wow.
Called Clutch Cafe. They sell our clothing. There's a store in Singapore. There's a store in Canada, I believe, and we're just now launching an online store for America.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah, Old Crow Clothing. That's what it is. OldCrowClothing.com. Mm-hmm.
Oh, man. So now, with everything that you've done so far, in just, I'll call it like we talked about earlier, Americana, right? And I know that you've got this concentration in hot rods and customs and things like that, but you really do have this multifaceted view of the world when it comes to this stuff, right? And do you see, especially just talking about the Japanese, do you see some trends coming up that we can expect to see now, or are there car trends that are happening right now that interest you? Is there stuff like I don't know, everything from overlanding to brodozer trucks and things like that? Is there stuff that you're seeing right now that you have any interest in, or can you look at like the today version of you, the 21-year-old or the 19-year-old, and look at that person and go, yeah, I can see they've got a spark there that we're going to appreciate in a couple of years with some sort of like, push or style or trend in cars? Do you see that stuff?
Well, first of all, I don't know what a brodozer is, but
I'll send you a video.
I can pretty much see it in my mind. Okay.
It's probably everything you can imagine. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. Well, I mean, as far as like futuristic stuff, I mean, I definitely do see a strong future in EV conversions for old cars.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I kind of think, let's say 20 years from now, there could possibly be more old cars on the street on a daily basis through EV conversions than we have now.
Wow.
But that's so far beyond my world that that's just a hunch. But from what I'm seeing with the younger kids, at least in our scene, is that they're kind of sticking to traditional Americana. I think in a weird way, like for instance, if you went to Europe or Germany or somewhere, and like it was like Bastille Day or something, right? You'd walk out of your hotel, thousands of people are wearing lederhosen or whatever traditional dress of their country, playing that music, parading down the street with those vehicles or whatever it is, and they're just celebrating their culture. Okay,
right.
America never really had that. Like maybe there'll be a Civil War reenactment over there, but those guys are weird. And there's a World War II reenactment that everybody's cuckoos, and then there's medieval times over here. But you don't get that. Like everyone across America gets up and dresses like Abraham Lincoln for the day and parades down the street. You don't get that. But I think that with American pop culture, early hot rodding, and the scene that we kind of all started in the 90s as a revival, I think that revival is now becoming kind of a standard. And especially when you have events that you can do with your car. So I meet a lot of people in their 20s, and they're not talking to me about some weird, crazy idea to do with the car that I've never thought of before. They're talking about exactly doing with the car what a car looked like in 1942 or 1939. They're usually telling me, oh, I want to build a period perfect pre-war dry lace car. And I'm like, awesome. That's great.
That's amazing to hear.
Yeah. And some are picking up, like some of the really young guys are picking up like their dad's Model T obsessions and doing like bone stock Model Ts or stripped down Model Ts. Yeah, but I haven't really seen anybody, and that whole rat rod crazy truck thing kind of like came and went, and I think now it's kind of getting brushed under the corner, like those bagger bikes from the 90s.
Yes.
So And I think that the cream of the crop is rising to the top, which is just the pure essence of hot rodding. And
Wow.
I think that's going to become a standard tradition. I'm hoping forever.
I hope you're right, man, and I'm glad to hear that you're seeing that, because I'd always been afraid, like, classic good style is always classic good style. Like, it's timeless, and I think that's one of the things that I think you embody so much is that you've picked up on and appreciate and sort of project just timeless good style that goes across generations, it goes across decades. It's always going to be good, right?
And like it never
right?
goes out of style,
right?
It's like I tell some of these contractors and architects who are they'll build a weird condo in LA. Well, that condo is dated in 15 years.
Yeah.
And the next owner after 20 years has to do a giant remodel to make it look fresh and new. But if they would just build it to look like it had been built there in the 40s, it would never go out of style. It would always timeless. Be there.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Right.
But as far, the only other trend I've seen, which is kind of frightening to all of us, is kids who just don't want to get a driver's license at all. They have no desire to drive.
Yeah, that's been a real topic of conversation around here lately.
I'm sure it has.
Yeah.
I'm sure it has.
Right. Like the phone is the experience that the car used to enable, in some sort of way,
Yeah, the phone is freedom.
Right.
And you'll have that freedom when you're 12 years old. We had to wait till we were 16 to get a driver's license
to get out of the house.
Now have that freedom. But now you can get out of the house in your own bedroom.
Yeah, right. That's a really good point. And I'm hoping, I've talked about this a lot, and I know you've probably, dealt with this too, that, when we talk about, well, what are kids going to be into, and generations even, older than you and me, Bobby, I think, are saying, well, they just, kids these days, they don't really, and the problem with, and as soon as you hear that phrase, the problem with, it's all over, right? The problem with kids these days. And what I find is that,
but we heard our parents say the same thing.
Right, exactly. And it's almost as if the generations never learn that essentially what you're saying is, well, because they're not coming to, in this case, because they're not coming to cars in exactly the way we did, they must not know anything, and it's like, if you're seeing that they're coming to pre-war cars and hot rods and dry lakesters and things like that in their own way, that's amazing. Because what they're not seemingly doing is coming at cars and saying, what would be really cool, a pair of Lion Tamer shorts and Air Jesus sandals. Like, thank God they're not saying that, or at least not yet. And maybe that'll be vintage someday, but hopefully not. Right? Maybe the Old Crow line is going to feature a pair of like Lion Tamer shorts someday. I don't know, and maybe like a fluorescent green tank top. Maybe not.
Well, we're going to be in the old folk home sitting around talking about it.
Right.
So we'll see what it is we're bitching about when we're 90 years old.
Bobby, I really appreciate, man. This has been great. I'm glad that I'm glad I got to find out how you got to LA, because I knew you once you got to LA, but I never knew how you got here. So that's been amazing. Really appreciate this time with you, man. This has been great.
Well, I've been the biggest fan of Los Angeles since I was a kid.
Yeah.
And I still am.
You still are. Yeah. You're celebrating it, man. And I think that especially these days when I think the car world in particular is looking at other things. It's almost like the alternative LA, and everything's compared to LA. People compare, it's, well, Nashville's the new LA, or, Oklahoma City's the new LA, or whatever. And it's like, no, LA is still the new LA. I mean, there's still going to be that. LA is always going to, I think, it's fairly universally true, that LA is always going to keep its stake in that claim, right? Like, it's always going to be the birth of this.
Well, until it falls into the ocean, of course.
Well, yeah, there's that. That'll happen. Maybe that'll happen before Lion Tamers become classic.
Let's hope.
Let's hope.
I'm like, later.
Yeah, right. Where we're done. Cash me out. Cash me outside. All right, Bobby. Thanks a lot, man.
Dan, it's been really great talking to you.
This has been a lot of fun.
Before we get off, let me do one thing. I know you and I go back really far.
We do.
But I cannot for the life of me remember how far and where we met. Do you?
I was going to say it had to be when I first, like I said, when I moved here in 2001 and I'd gotten that magazine going. I think at some point we first met if it wasn't at Bigfoot Lodge in San Francisco, it must have been down in LA when I handed you those magazines. This is probably one of the first times we met. Yeah, and you still have them. Yeah, that's crazy.
I did.
It's amazing.
I read them every day.
Look at that. Yeah, you read it for the articles, right? That's awesome. That was to bring
Great
that one back.
To you.
You too, Bobby. Thanks again, man. All right.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening, folks. And again, please subscribe to the Hot Rod Barbecue podcast. If you're on Spotify, check us out there. Subscribe to it on iTunes. And if you are going to go to YouTube, make sure you go to the Hot Rod Barbecue podcast and hit that subscribe button. And we'll come to you every week.